I am here with one of Germany's foremost political analysts, Gretel Wagner. Gretel, it's good to have you here.
It's great to be here, thank you.
There certainly has been a great deal of political unrest recently, but let's start off with some background for our listeners. Please explain the particular governmental system the Weimar Republic operates within.
Certainly. The Weimar Republic was created in 1919 as an attempt to reform the decision-making process in Germany and regain authority in the midst of chaos. Our current government has at its head a president, currently Paul von Hindenburg. The president is the head of armed forces and decides when to call elections in the Reichstag, the main legislative body. Article 48 in the Constitution also gives the president the power to rule without the Reichstag in the event of a state of emergency. In addition, the president has the power to select and dismiss his own chancellor. However, unlike the previous single-party state, the chancellor and his approved cabinet answer to the Reichstag. The Reichstag is composed of entirely elected officials who debate issues and propose new legislation. Once passed by the Reichstag, the new law is then either ratified or rejected by the Reichsrat. The members of this body are appointed by regional governments in rough proportion to the size of that particular state. Each of the regional governments has its own state parliament, which manages education and local police and judiciary affairs.
Now let's talk about the political issues Germany is dealing with today. What can you tell us about polarization and shifting trends in the Reichstag?
With the recent economic crash came unemployment, hyperinflation, and most notably, fear. As the country began to descend into violent instability, many people gravitated towards more extremist beliefs. Popularity of the extreme left and extreme right wing soared. The Nazi Party, however, benefited more from this than the communists, as landowners continued to fear a communist uprising similar to the one in Russia that would likely strip them of their land. Hitler's strong leadership also drew many followers. Furthermore, the Nazi Party's strong stance on protecting struggling peasants and reducing unemployment gained widespread support. In accordance with such trends, the Nazis are the largest party in the Reichstag, and therefore had a great deal of power over the formation of any coalition governments that are necessary to combat the huge economic issues facing Germany.
And why did Hindenburg, who it has been heard has great contempt for Hitler, recently appoint him chancellor?
Hindenburg dismissed his first chancellor, Hermann Müller, and instead appointed Heinrich von Brüning to the position. Brüning, however, had almost no support in the Reichstag. Hindenburg was then forced to use emergency measures to pass any laws. By 1932, Hindenburg could no longer support the widely unpopular Brüning and appointed instead Franz von Papen. He hoped that von Papen's more conservative views would make him more popular than his previous chancellor. He was unfortunately mistaken. Von Papen commanded even less support in the Reichstag than Brüning. At this point, Hindenburg began to fear continuing the government without a parliamentary majority, as it would be more susceptible to a communist takeover. A more stable government would also be more ready to deal with the economic crisis. The Nazis emerged victorious, gaining even more seats and a clear majority. At this point, Hindenburg was desperate for support in order to create a coalition to deal with the huge economic crisis facing Germany. He asked Hitler specifically to join one, hoping for him to bring his vast support behind Hindenburg. Hitler, however, told him that he would only join if he were made chancellor. Afraid of his aggressive ambition, Hindenburg refused. He held yet another general election late in 1932, in which the Nazi Party lost 32 seats in the Reichstag. However, they retained a majority, and Hindenburg could not get Hitler's support without appointing him chancellor, something he was still unwilling to do. He instead appointed General Kurt von Schleicher. Schleicher, like von Papen, commanded almost no support from the Reichstag, despite Hindenburg's hopes. By January of this year, Hindenburg decided that he needed to give in to Hitler's demands in order to make any real progress with the Reichstag. He appointed him chancellor somewhat more easily than he would have at the beginning of 1932, because he believed he could maintain control over him due to the Nazi Party's diminished role in the Reichstag. It remains to be seen whether he will be able to or not.
Well, that's all the time we have for now. Join us after the break for some financial wisdom from our resident financial expert, Janina Bratwurst. Janina Bratwurst, everyone!
Guten Tag, you look good, Heidi.
Thank you. So, the other day I saw a woman carting cash around in a wheelbarrow. Fashion statement? I think not. Financial guru, impart your knowledge.
I saw the same woman, Heidi. You can thank inflation.
You mean the Ruhr crisis?
I mean, yes and no. It's a common misconception to think that the Ruhr crisis caused inflation. Inflation has been a serious problem since the outbreak of the Great War. The occupation of the Ruhr caused hyperinflation, which is what you're referring to. By printing money to support striking workers, the German government fed the inflationary pressures that had been building since the war. For instance, by late 1923, the German mark, historically valued at 4 to the US dollar, became worth less than the paper on which it was printed.
How did this happen?
What, the Ruhr? Well, if you recall, Wilhelm Kuno's government was overwhelmed by the reparations situation. When our government failed to hand over its reparation payments in January 1923, France and Belgium decided to send 60,000 troops into the Ruhr. Kuno ordered workers in the Ruhr to engage in passive resistance, and we sabotaged French attempts to transport raw materials back to France. There was bloodshed, the French sealed the Ruhr off from the rest of Germany, and our economy tanked. Gustav Stresemann, then the leader of the DVP, which, if you don't know, is the German People's Party, became chancellor in August 1923. He ordered workers to cooperate with the French and resume reparation payments. The banker he brought in, Hajar Schott, introduced the Rentenmark, which is 10 billion old marks. In 1924, the Rentenmark was replaced by the Reichsmark.
Holy!
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. Hyperinflation, my friend. It killed domestic investment. This is called Germany losing faith in Germany. Germans lacking the confidence to invest in German business. So I guess, given the situation, the Dawes Plan, mentioned before, may have seemed like a blessing at first. Dawes gave us the jumpstart. American money pouring into German businesses, feeding our foreign imports and industrial output. On the downside, it made us incredibly dependent on U.S. loans. When the Wall Street crash happened, America recalled its loans and we tanked. Actually, probably the most of any European nation. Millions of middle-class Germans, especially those in retirement, saw their life savings wiped out overnight. So, enter woman with the wheelbarrow.
Wow, pretty bleak.
Well, not for debtors. Hyperinflation lets people who borrowed money pay off their debts with currency that is worth only a tiny fraction of what they had originally borrowed. So you, for instance, can pay me back for those lederhosen I bought you last spring.
We'll talk after this. But wait, so you mentioned Wall Street crash before. I thought that was an American affair. It was a terrible financial crisis, sure, but did it have any effects on our economy? Are we safe? Is anyone safe?
Well, Heidi, funny you should ask. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 was definitely an international fiasco. Major effects. It wiped millions off the values of American shares, which led U.S. investors to withdraw their money from Germany. Businesses here went bankrupt, banks collapsed, and people became scared to invest their money. The result you see now is soaring unemployment. But let's backtrack a little bit. On the eve of the Great Depression, there was just under 2 million unemployed in Germany. This rose to 3.5 million in 1930, 4.4 million in 1931, and peaked late last year at 6 million. 6 million! That's a lot of angry Germans with wheelbarrows. The Depression, unlike the crisis of 1923, was a deflationary crisis, which means that prices went down rather than up. This destroyed profit margins and caused more businesses to go bust. The value of Germany's exports fell from the 630 million in 1929 to just about 280 million last year. To answer your question, we are not safe. No one is safe. I'm crunching the numbers, but everyone can feel the effects. People have to stop thinking of our economies as these isolated entities. We are all connected like limbs on a puppet. You pull on one string, the whole creature jerks.
God, nicht so gut.
Nicht so gut indeed.
You're taking me out for something strong after this. But just so our viewers don't follow this segment with a bridge and a jump, what now?
Well, global trade has collapsed. We have a huge budget deficit. Germany is a risk with no reward. I could actually use that something strong right about now.
On that note, we have recently recovered audio from our foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann, who has unfortunately passed. We thought this information would help us.
In what ways has the Weimar Republic been successful in creating peaceful relations with other European nations thus far?
In order to initiate a healthy relation with other European nations, it was crucial for our country to participate in the Locarno conferences. Our conviction within the Weimar Republic was to avoid any further armed conflict. Through a non-aggression pact, Germany, along with France and Belgium, agreed to not utilize force in regards to manipulating borders that had been instituted under the Treaty of Versailles. As I had already formed a sturdier relation with Briand, following the United States' sound contributions under the Dawes Plan, we began these Locarno conferences with the assumption that a peaceful outcome would prosper. And indeed, we succeeded. In our dear country's acceptance of the Treaty of Versailles initiatives, such as with the Rhineland and the newly configured reparation assignments, we had formed peaceful associations with our once hated enemies.
But didn't you continuously disregard any attempt to reconstruct the reparations that France had already agreed to reconfigure?
Sir, you are accusing me. I simply attempted to create the best situation for the good of my entire nation, while keeping in mind the ideologies of the European nations that had finally accepted the German initiative. And in all honesty, after watching my nation's acceptance into the League of Nations in 1926, I felt as if it was my duty to rally for the best possible conditions for Germany. In order to avoid armed conflict, what nation would want the unhappiness of a nation as powerful as Germany? So in order to accomplish the completion of German war reparations without any hostility towards other nations, of course, we needed to establish a more sound and reliable tactic for paying reparations. However, the League of Nations was not doing what it set out to do. So, the United States, who had so graciously prepared the Dawes Act in our regard, also compiled the Young Plan, which of course I accepted wholeheartedly. With this plan, we will continue to get helpful loans, which in turn will be spread over the next 50 years. Furthermore, there will no longer be unwarranted Allied occupation in the Rhineland. We can't discuss current events without talking about our new Reich Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. We brought in renowned historian Hannah Schultz to tell our listeners a little bit more about our new leader. Hello, Hannah. How are you?
Hello, Heidi. I'm well. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. So, what can you tell us about our new chancellor?
Where to begin? Well, Hitler has been a household name since the infamous Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, in which he attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government and, in his point of view, bring the November criminals to justice. As you may know, the November criminals are those who formed the provisional government of the Weimar Republic at the end of the Great War. Because of the severe financial problems that ensued during its reign, the term November criminals was coined because the German government was held responsible for causing such problems. The Beer Hall Putsch was a failure, and Hitler was put on trial for treason. It was during his trial that Hitler became a national celebrity, as the press covered the trial in detail, often including quotes promoting the Nazi regime and Hitler's innocence. Hitler was determined guilty, but received a minor sentence of 5 years with eligibility of parole after 6 months. During his prison sentence, which ended up only being 9 months, he dictated his beliefs and future plans for Germany to Rudolf Hess to form the now infamous Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf highlights Hitler's anti-Semitic views and his future plans for Germany, including his reasoning behind Lebensraum, the idea that the superior Aryan race has the right to expand territorially to provide space for the population to grow. The sales of Mein Kampf were unexpectedly low when first released in 1925, but have recently been soaring since Hitler became Reich Chancellor. Hitler stayed out of sight from 1926 to 1929, as he was banned from public speaking after he viciously denounced Jews, Marxists, and Democratic Republicans at a speech in February of 1925. He did not disappear completely, though. He spent the time reorganizing the Nazi Party and formed the Hitler Youth. By 1929, Hitler's opportunity to power had come. The stock market crash of 1929 had reverberating effects around the world. Germany was not spared. As Janina Bratwurst mentioned earlier, the crash left the German economy depleted and millions out of work. The political split following the crash left a vacant spot for a new political organization, and Hitler rose to power swiftly and confidently. Hitler won the 1932 Reichstag election, mostly due to the fact that Hindenburg thought Hitler was his best option to gain support in the Reichstag. In January 1933, just 1 month ago, he was elected Reich Chancellor. It is hard to tell at this point what the German opinion of our new Chancellor is, but thus far the German people have been very supportive, as seen by the polls of the 1932 election. So there you have it, Heidi. I hope that provides a little more depth to Hitler's rise to Reich Chancellor.
Well, Hannah, thank you so much for your insight.
My pleasure.
Well, folks, that concludes our segment for the day. Thank you for joining us and auf Wiedersehen!
Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt. Denn es steht zum Schutz und Tod